Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with cloud eggs. That's right, you've probably seen these things blowing up on social media recently. And by recently, I mean like 2 years ago. But anyway, I finally got around to shooting a video for these. And I'm glad I did. Right, these things are very easy to do and a lot of fun to make. And of course, super cool to look at. Plus, as much as I hate to admit it, since this really is a gimmick, very, very enjoyable to eat. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by separating a couple large eggs, which I like to do by cracking the egg into a clean hand, and then carefully letting the whites drip between my fingers into a bowl, at which point we'll reserve the yolk in a separate and much smaller bowl. And a lot of people get nervous about doing this step, which in the business we refer to as separation anxiety. But this hand method is very easy and works almost every time. And yes, I've seen the suck the yolk out with the empty water bottle trick, and I'm not impressed. Yes, it looks cool, and you can Google that if you want, but this works just as good and is easier. And then what we'll do once those have been separated is add a few drops of vinegar to our whites. And I use champagne vinegar, but literally anything will work. And then we'll also add a pinch of salt. And then we will take a whisk, the biggest and most bulbous one we have, and we will whip these egg whites until we have relatively firm, but not dry peaks. Okay, the most common mistake with these is over-whipping the whites. And by the way, do not use an electric mixer for these. All right, 2 egg whites is only going to take you a couple minutes to whisk up. And if you use the electric mixer, they won't have any soul. But anyway, like I said, we're going to go ahead and whisk these until we have peaks that will hold their shape, but are still a little bit soft and very luxurious. And if everything goes according to plan, they should look exactly like this. All right, not to brag, but those are perfect. And then what we'll do once those have been meringued is go ahead and take a spoon and form our 2 clouds on a lightly buttered Silpat line baking sheet. And of course, the exact size and shape of the clouds are up to you, although I do strongly recommend going with the cumulus. Okay, you're going to want to avoid the stratus, and under no circumstances should you attempt a cirrus. And one tip here, try not to make these too wide. Okay, we really do want these to have some nice height. I mean, not like cumulonimbus height, but a little bit of verticality is nice. And as we finish shaping these, we're going to want to form a little depression in the top, in which we will place our yolk later. And that's it. Once we've finished making our happy little clouds, we'll go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 5 minutes or so, or until they start taking on just a little tiny bit of color. Okay, we do not want to overcook these. Otherwise, they're going to get tough and dry. Plus, they're going to cook a little more once we add our yolks, which is the next step. And if you're not sure your wells are deep enough, you could press it down a little bit with a spoon, like I did here, even though that was probably unnecessary. But either way, we'll go ahead and carefully transfer our yolks in, at which point we'll pop these back in the oven for another 3 minutes or so, or until that yolk is just barely heated through, and that surface sort of starts to glaze over and look a little bit glassy. But, and most importantly, they're still runny. Okay, if you're not going to make these with runny yolks, please don't make them. And that's it, we'll go ahead and transfer our cloud egg onto a piece of generously buttered toast. And I finish mine up with a little shake of cayenne, plus a little too big of a pinch of coarse sea salt. Okay, I forgot I put a generous pinch in the whites, so be careful with the salt. And that's it, my cloud egg was done. And we are ready for the money shot in 3, 2, 1. Oh yeah. And if you enjoy a piece of buttered toast, dipped into a runny yolk egg, you are going to absolutely love this. And what makes this such an enjoyable / bizarre experience is that the yolk and the toast elements are totally normal, and yet you're enjoying them alongside this puffed up, airy egg meringue. So yes, it's quite unusual, but happily still very delicious and extremely enjoyable. And of course, if you want to dress this up with some fresh herbs, like some chives or tarragon or dill, that would not be a bad idea. Or you could do some kind of Eggs Benedict presentation and serve this on top of an English muffin and Canadian bacon. In which case, we'd probably use a little bit of lemon juice instead of vinegar in the egg whites. But anyway, those kind of variations are up to you. I mean, you guys are after all the pegs of your cloud eggs. Which reminds me, my mother-in-law's name is Peggy, and I'm thinking this would make a pretty cool menu item for a Mother's Day brunch. Okay, social distancing notwithstanding. But anyway, no matter what the occasion, our official Food Wishes forecast calls for a chance of clouds, with a little bit of sun peeking through. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, Enjoy. Strawberry Oatmeal Breakfast Bars. That's right, I'm always on the lookout for easy and delicious things to make for breakfast that on one hand are relatively healthy and good for you, while on the other hand not too good for you. Since after fasting all night, we do want something that seems like a little bit of a treat. And I really do think these fit the bill. Oh, and by the way, these are usually made with strawberry preserves, but here we're using fresh strawberries for a little bit lighter, less high sugar approach. But don't worry, they're going to be sweet enough. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by dicing our berries. And that'll begin by removing those green leaves from the top, using the tip of a small sharp knife. And sure, if you have one, you could use a strawberry huller, but most people don't have those, so just do it this way. And then what we'll do once that's hulled is place that cut side down and then slice it in half. And then we will cut each of those halves lengthwise, like 3 or 4 or 5 times, depending on the size of the strawberry, before turning and cutting across into a nice uniform dice. And that's it. Very simple, very easy. So we'll go ahead and do that to about 1 pound of strawberries, which is going to give us about 3 cups. And then to those we will add a little touch of freshly squeezed lemon juice, along with a little bit of white granulated sugar. And then we'll finish up with a couple teaspoons of cornstarch. At which point we'll take a spoon and mix this very thoroughly, or at the very least until all that cornstarch disappears. And that's it. We will simply let that sit out at room temp while we move on to our only other component, our oatmeal mixture, which is going to start with some rolled oats, or as they're called in every recipe for some reason, old-fashioned rolled oats. I mean, is there some kind of new trendy style of rolled oats I don't know about? But anyway, to that we will add some flour. And I'm going to use half white all-purpose and half wheat. Although if you want, you can use all one or the other. We'll also need a half a cup of firmly packed brown sugar, as well as a little bit of salt, and a nice healthy pinch of ground ginger, which is lovely with both strawberries and oats. And then to bring all this together, we will pour in 1 stick of melted unsalted butter, also known as 8 tablespoons, or 4 fluid ounces, or 120 ml as they say in France. Only they say it in French. And that's it. Once everything's in there, we'll go ahead and work this over with a spoon until we are 100% positive that butter has coated every grain of sugar and every single rolled oat. And if everything goes according to plan, it should look something like this. And don't be concerned if this mixture looks a little dry to you. Okay, don't forget we're using fresh strawberries, which are going to release a fair amount of liquid. So we're going to be okay. And then once that's set, we'll go ahead and transfer 60% of that mixture into the bottom of a buttered baking dish. And we'll do our best to get that as even as possible. And if you're wondering, how the heck am I supposed to transfer exactly 60% in? Well, you're not. Okay, just transfer in what you think is about half, and then add a little more. And once that's been accomplished, what we'll do is pack it down a little bit with the back of a spoon or a spatula, just to compress and compact that a little bit, before we top it with our strawberries. And if we have one, what we'll want to use here is a slotted spoon, so that any of those excess juices stay in the bowl. At least for now. Oh, and unlike that layer of crumbs we just did, we do not want these diced strawberries compressed. So we'll sort of sprinkle those over with a relatively light touch. And the reason for that is, we want our top layer of crumbs to sort of nestle down into all the nooks and crannies. And if we press these strawberries down now, there aren't going to be any nooks, and there are certainly not going to be any crannies. So please spoon those over without pressing them down. Oh, and once you're done, do not discard any of those accumulated juices. Okay, we're going to use those in a minute. And that's it. To finish this, we'll simply sprinkle over the rest of our crumbs, which should settle in and around those pieces of strawberry quite nicely. But once the last of our crumbs have been applied, then we can and should give this a nice pressing with the back of the spoon. Okay, we really don't want to press those strawberries down into the bottom layer too much, but I think we do want everything nicely compacted. And then for one final touch, we'll go ahead and take that tablespoon or 2 of strawberry juices from the bowl, and we will spoon that over the top. And when we can't spoon anymore, we will let it drip over the top. And that's it. Once that's been juiced, it is now ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 45 minutes or so, or until it looks like this. Okay, that top should definitely be golden brown, and if it's not, put it back in for a while. And then before we serve this, we have to let it cool all the way down. I mean, you could serve it now, but you need a spoon, and probably some vanilla ice cream. But if we want breakfast bars, we have to let this cool. Although one thing we can do while this is still hot is take a spatula and give this a nice firm pressing. And what that'll do is give us a little nicer, a little denser texture once this is cooled. So we'll give that a pressing and let it cool down to room temp, at which point we can go ahead and cut that into bars. And I cut mine once down the middle, and then turned it and cut it across into 8 portions, which is a fairly generous serving. Okay, you could definitely cut those bars in half to make 16. But of course, that's up to you. I mean, you are after all the Bruno Mars of your Strawberry Oatmeal Breakfast Bars. But if you are actually going to have these for breakfast, I think cutting this into 8 makes the perfect size. Oh, and speaking of size, if you want these thicker, just use a smaller pan. But personally, I do like the thinner approach. But anyway, I served that up and went in for a taste. And if you've cooked it long enough and let it cool all the way down, it should stay together in bar form. And if it doesn't, you must have done something wrong. But that's okay. Just eat it with a fork. But no matter what's your delivery system, I think you're going to find these every bit as delicious as I did. Right, the combination of that fresh, just sweet enough strawberry component and those sort of crusty, chewy, granola-like oatmeal crumbs really does make for a wonderful thing to eat. And as I mentioned, these types of fruity breakfast bars are usually made with preserves and tend to be a lot sweeter and more dessert-like. But by using the fresh strawberries, we've achieved something a little bit on the lighter side, yet still sweet enough and very, very satisfying. But if you did want to turn up the sweetness a little bit, some people like to pipe over a few stripes of icing, which is kind of pretty and definitely makes these a little more dessert-like. But personally, especially for breakfast, I like these just the way they are. But either way, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. The Ben Franklin Breakfast Bowl. That's right, as Benjamin Franklin used to say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, which I do believe to be true. Or at least I hope so, since I enjoy one of these beautiful breakfast bowls almost every morning. And since trying to eat better and feel better in the new year is such a popular resolution, I thought the timing was perfect to share this with you. Remember, as I've said before, the longer you live, the more ad revenue you generate. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with what's really the only work involved here, and that's to cut up one apple. And since we're going to do this on an empty stomach, still half asleep, we're going to need some kind of very fast, easy method, which this is. So what we're going to do is make our first cut straight down, about 1/4 inch from the stem, which should just miss the seeds in the core. And once that first piece is taken off, that'll leave us with a nice flat base, and we'll position our apple as shown, and make a second cut this way, straight down, again about 1/4 inch away from the stem. And then we'll simply turn and make our third cut, followed by our fourth and final cut, at which point we should be looking at a fairly nicely cored apple. And then once that's set, again with the flat side down, we will cut up our apple into small cubes by slicing across, and then turning and cutting across the other way, into whatever size we want. And normally at this point I'll say pick a size and stick with it. But since we're not cooking this, having these pieces all the same size doesn't really matter. Although it is good practice. So try to get them close. Just for me. And by the way, for my Ben Franklin breakfast bowls, I always chill the apples. Okay, I want them very cold and very crisp. So if you remember, go ahead and pop those in the fridge the night before. But that's optional and up to you. Alright, you are after all the founding father of whether to bother. But I do think this is better if the apples are nice and cold. But anyway, once cut, we'll go ahead and transfer those into a bowl and move on to the second most important ingredient, some plain yogurt. And I'm going to go into detail on the blog, but I'm using sheep's milk yogurt, which is my favorite. And we really don't need to or want to use a yogurt that has added sugar to it. So I am recommending the plain yogurt here. And if you're keeping score at home, I'm using one 6-ounce container. And then once our yogurt's been spooned on and seductively swirled, we will top with a few tablespoons of granola. And besides trying to eat a nice healthy breakfast every morning, my other New Year's resolution is try to learn how to focus the camera. But anyway, we'll go ahead and add a couple spoons of granola for some extra sweetness and of course some crunchy texture. And that, my friends, is pretty much it for my basic Ben Franklin breakfast bowl that I enjoy almost every morning, like probably 4 to 5 days a week. But if we want, we are allowed to garnish with a few extra little seasonal items. Alright, in my case, I'm going to finish this one off with a little bit of diced persimmon, as well as a few chopped up roasted almonds. And because we are trying to keep this light and nutritious, you are allowed to accessorize this with any kind of fresh fruit you want, as well as the nuts and seeds of your choice. But what you want to try to stay away from is dried fruit, which will tend to add a lot of sugar and calories. And since we really don't need the extra sweetness, and we already have plenty of fiber, dried fruit is something I tend to avoid. And along the same lines, you do not need to drizzle this with honey or maple syrup or anything like that. All right, I promise you it's going to be absolutely delicious served as is. So let me go ahead and grab a spoon and dig in. And what I enjoy so much about this is the contrast not only between the flavors, but also the textures. All right, we have that cold, juicy, crispy sweet apple, which pairs perfectly with our creamy, slightly tart yogurt. And then as far as texture goes, we have that crunch from our granola and chopped nuts, keeping things interesting. And for a bowl of food that probably comes in somewhere between 300 and 400 calories, this is very satisfying and relatively filling. And only takes a couple minutes to put together. All right, your average fast food drive-through wait time is about 4.5 minutes. So not only is this significantly better for you, it's just as fast and comes with much less shame and guilt. All right, so there's nothing wrong with the occasional drive-through breakfast sandwich. But as far as a regular morning routine, I'm thinking that this breakfast bowl is probably a better way to go. And I'm pretty sure the ghost of Benjamin Franklin would agree. In fact, if he does, knock twice. Close enough. So for those reasons and more, I really do hope you give this a try soon. And head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Chocolate almond breakfast donuts. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make gluten-free, grain-free, low-carb, high-protein donuts that are healthy enough to eat for breakfast without all the guilt and shame. And you might be thinking, that sounds great, but they must taste terrible like all quote-unquote healthy donuts. Well, that's the thing. They don't. They taste good. Really good. Especially covered in chocolate. But we'll get into all the loopholes later. For now, let's get started with one of the easiest batters we've ever done, which is going to start with 2 whole large eggs, to which we will add a couple tablespoons of vegetable oil, or the liquid fat of your choice. Okay, I went with something neutral in flavor here, but you could do melted butter or coconut oil, or speaking of healthy, extra virgin olive oil. And then we are going to need to sweeten this up a little bit, and for that I'm going to use some maple syrup. And that's it, we'll go ahead and take a whisk, and mix this very enthusiastically for a couple minutes, until everything becomes beautifully emulsified and a little bit foamy. Oh, and if you wanted to add a little bit of vanilla extract here, that would be fine. And I actually did in one of the test batches, and to be honest, I really didn't notice a big difference. So I'll leave that up to you. But anyway, once we have that mixed up, we'll stop and move on to the dry ingredients. Starting with the most important, some finely ground almond flour. And by the way, not all almond flours are ground the same way. So if you want yours to come out exactly like mine using the same amount, you're going to have to get yours from a guy named Bob who lives in a red mill down by the river. But having said that, anything ground similar to this should work out fine. And then we'll finish this off with some baking powder, a little bit of salt, and then a couple spoons of a high-quality Dutch processed cocoa. Oh yeah, that's the pretty one that has that beautiful deep red-brown color. And then once everything's been bowled, we'll take a spatula and give this a thorough mixing. And if you're wondering, why didn't you mix up all the dry ingredients first like you usually do? Or at the very least, break up all those clumps of almond meal? Well, that is a good question. And that's because almond flour does not contain any gluten, so there is absolutely no danger in overmixing this batter. Okay, you could mix this for an hour, and nothing bad would happen, other than maybe a sore shoulder. But anyway, the point is we will mix that fearlessly until all that almond flour has disappeared, at which point we can set that aside, and we'll move on to prep our donut pan, which looks like this. And they say this is already nonstick, but they say a lot of things. So to hedge our bets, we will also give this a generous spray with some vegetable oil. And yes, you can just brush that in instead, or use some softened butter. And then the easiest way to get our batter into the pan would be to transfer it into a piping bag, or one of these plastic zip-top bags. And I don't do a lot of freeze frames, but I'm going to do one here, since I was just about to use my finger to clean off the spatula, which would have been a bad idea, since this batter is extremely sticky. So what we really want to do is use the inside of the bag to wipe off the spatula, thereby keeping our fingers nice and clean. And then once that's been transferred in, and we've sort of pushed it all together, we will take our scissors and cut about 1 inch off the corner. And that should allow us to very efficiently and effectively, and without making a big mess, transfer this into our pan. Oh, and did I mention these are also high fiber? At least compared to a regular donut. But anyway, we'll go ahead and pipe in our batter as evenly as we can. And in a perfect world, when we got to that last one, we would have used up all our batter. But that world has not been discovered yet. And we're probably going to be left with a little bit still in the bag. So we will just go around adding a little more to each one, wherever we think it makes sense. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and use our finger to press down and even out the tops. But not with a dry finger. Right, we're going to want to dip it in water first, since as I mentioned, this batter is extremely sticky. And that's it. Once we have all our batter pressed down and evenly distributed, we'll go ahead and give that the old tappa on the counter to settle that batter down even more. At which point these are ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 9 or 10 minutes, or until they look like this. But as you know, we try not to go by looks in the kitchen. So we'll want to check to make sure a skewer comes out clean, which mine did. And then what we need to do is let these sit in the pan for 10 minutes so they don't break apart when we turn them out. So we will wait 600 seconds, at which point we should be able to safely turn over the pan to reveal some pretty gorgeous looking donuts, and some relatively light ones at that. Okay, some of these almond flour recipes are super dense and heavy, but this one was not. And then, like virtually every delicious baked good we want to eat right away, we cannot eat this one right away. For best results, we really do want to let these cool down to room temp, which is fine, because that's going to give us time to decorate these, which I'm going to do first by dipping the tops in some melted chocolate. And contrary to popular belief, if you use a nice high percentage chocolate, it really doesn't contain a lot of sugar, and don't even get me started on the antioxidants. And yes, believe it or not, additional fiber. So if you can, try to use something that's like 70 or 80% cacao, even though I'm cheating and using something that's 63. But anyway, I went ahead and dipped those in chocolate and then smoothed out the tops a little bit with a spoon before I moved on to garnishing the tops. And for that, I'm going to do a couple dipped in toasted coconut flakes. And if you're a fan of the good old-fashioned Almond Joy candy bar, I think that would be the way to go. So I did 2 with coconut and then moved on to do a couple more with chopped almonds. And I was originally going to use sliced, but then I thought it looked too similar to the coconut, and I decided to do them roughly chopped instead. And by the way, while your chocolate coating is still wet, you are able to do any kind of adjusting and fine-tuning you want. And then for the 2 middle ones, I was just going to leave those plain chocolate, but after looking at the garnishes on either side, I decided they needed a little something. So I went around and applied a few chocolate chips, which, by the way, Michelle thought was a big mistake. She thought those were redundant, unnecessary, and distracting. But anyway, you decide. I mean, you are, after all, the Samuel Morris of whether your donut looks like a stegosaurus. But regardless of what you garnish with, we're going to want to let those donuts cool completely, and for that chocolate on top to firm up before we serve. But once it does, we can go ahead and bite in. And that, my friends, considering the ingredients we used, is a pretty impressive chocolate donut. All right, lots of chocolatey flavor. And even though it makes up most of the batter, the flavor of almond does not overpower everything else. And here you can see they have a very similar crumb and texture to a regular cake donut. Which reminds me, that's not what you're supposed to compare these to. I mean, come on, we didn't use flour or butter or white sugar. So to compare these to a regular chocolate donut is not really fair. What these should be compared to are those expensive, uninteresting, virtually tasteless energy bars a lot of people eat for breakfast. Okay, these are way better than those. But anyway, I finished up that coconut version. And then I went ahead and plated up one with the chopped almonds so I could get some shots of it in its natural habitat, next to a nice hot cup of coffee. Although in the spirit of full disclosure, it was too late for coffee, so I just faked it with some tea and milk. That's right, that's prop coffee. Or as we call it in the business, covfefe. But anyway, that's it. What we're calling chocolate almond breakfast donuts. I'm going to go ahead and finish up with one final test. Will it dunk? And yes, it dunks. It dunks real good. But whether you dip or just bite and sip, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Chia chocolate pudding. That's right. You thought chia seeds were just for making small vegetation-based pets, but it's not. A lot of people are using it to make a very, very healthy breakfast, kind of porridge or pudding type mixture. And this stuff's just supposed to be packed with incredible nutritional benefits. But don't worry, I have a solution for that. We're going to make chocolate pudding out of it. So here we go. And the first question, what the heck are chia seeds? These are chia seeds. And if you live anywhere near civilization, I'm sure you can find these. Just ask one of your hippie friends, they'll know. Or order some on the internet. And then what we're going to do is we're going to dump that in a mixing bowl. To that, I'm going to add some brown sugar and some white sugar, along with a very high quality cocoa. I'm going to give it a little pinch of instant coffee, a few drops of vanilla, and then just the tiniest pinch of salt, like 12 grains of salt. Okay? And then for the chia seeds that work their magic, you have to have some kind of liquid. In this case, I'm using 2% milk. We're going to pour that milk in, and we're going to give it a stir. And cocoa hates to be mixed into things when they're cold. But don't worry, just keep stirring and stirring and stirring. And eventually you'll have a nice smooth mixture. And then all we're going to do is let this sit for about 5 minutes, at which point we're going to come back and give it a stir. And just after 5 minutes, you're going to notice it's already starting to thicken up a little bit. So give it a good mixing. And once we've mixed that up, we're going to go ahead and let it sit for another 5 minutes. And we'll do that like 2 or 3 more times. And each time you should notice it's getting a little thicker. And at that point, we can give it the old tappa for no reason other than I felt like saying it. And then we're going to wrap that up and put it in the fridge for what they say is a minimum of 2 hours. So I went ahead and threw mine in the fridge, and 2 hours later, I was looking at a pretty wild and crazy substance. Look at that. I don't know how they do it, but somehow all those little chia seeds thicken the mixture to the consistency of, well, chocolate pudding. And yes, it looks absolutely bizarre. So I took a little taste, and it actually was not bad. Although after only 2 hours, the seeds still had a little bit of crunch to them. And since I'd never used these before, I wasn't sure if that's just how they are, or if they were going to soften up a little more as it sat. So I decided to wrap it up and let it sit overnight. And the next day when we unwrapped it, it looked pretty much exactly the same. It didn't get any thicker, it didn't get any firmer. But that little bit of crunch inside the seed was still there, but it was not as pronounced. So at that point, I spooned mine into a pudding cup. I couldn't decide what to garnish it with. Whipped cream just seemed totally wrong. So I decided to go with chocolate-covered hemp seeds. That's right, hemp seeds, which I thought would mimic those little round chia globules. What are we supposed to call those things? So I sprinkled those over the top, and my chia chocolate pudding was done. And of course, if you've never heard the commercial, you have no idea why I keep saying chia. So you should probably check that out on YouTube. But anyway, that looks pretty good. Although I decided it didn't look as chocolatey against the wood as it did against the countertop, so I moved it back for the official taste test. And how was it? Well, it might be the hemp seeds talking, but it really was not bad at all. I mean, is it as rich and decadent as a real chocolate pudding? Of course not. We didn't use eggs and butter and cream and that kind of stuff. We basically used bird seeds. But considering we were able to make a fairly decent chocolatey dessert using such a nutritious superfood, I'd have to say this is a pretty interesting trick and definitely worth trying. And I'll talk about it on the blog post, but there's definitely things I would try in future attempts. Things like using coconut milk. I might do a little more sugar. I thought it could be a little sweeter. But anyway, all in all, I was pretty happy. So I do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.